Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It is my great pleasure to welcome Rabbi David Rosen, the brother of Jeremy Rosen, who you all know very well. So before I hand over to Rabbi Rosen, I'd just like to give you a brief introduction. Rabbi David Rosen, KSG, CBE, is the Jerusalem-based International Director of Interreligious Affairs of the AJC, the American Jewish Committee, the oldest American Jewish advocacy organization with more than 25 offices across the US and a dozen offices and representatives around the world. The third son of the late renowned Rabbi Rosen, founder of the Carmel College, David was educated in England and at a yeshivot in Israel. In addition to Israeli military service in the Tank Corps, he served as the military rabbi in West Sinai before going on Shilot with his wife Sharon to South Africa, where he became rabbi of the largest Jewish congregation in the country in Sea Point, Cape Town, and where he served on the Cape Beth Din. In 1979, he was appointed Chief Rabbi of Ireland, and after a period of 5 years service to the Irish community, he returned to Israel with his family to take up the position of Dean of the Sapir Center for Jewish Education in the Old City of Jerusalem. Amongst his many current honorary positions, he serves as the Chief Rabbinate of Israel's Committee for Interreligious Dialogue. He is an international president of Religions for Peace, the largest world multi-religious body. He is honorary president of the International Council of Christians and Jews and the Jewish member of the board of directors of the King Abdullah International Center for Interreligious and Intercultural Dialogue, established in 2012 by the King of Saudi Arabia, together with the governments of Austria and Spain, with the support of the Holy See. He is past chair of the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations, IJCIC, which represents world Jewry to other world religious bodies. Amongst his many honors, Rabbi Rosen was made a papal knight by the Pope and a commander of the British Empire, CBE, by Queen Elizabeth II. Wow, very impressive, Rabbi Rosen. And, you know, I've so been looking forward to today. I know you're great friends with Helen and Michael Liebman. And I feel that even though I've never met you in person, the wonderful things that I've heard about both of you from her, I'm so looking forward to us getting together in Jerusalem, please God, one day in the near future. So I'd like to say very warm welcome. I'd like to say thank you to Helen for the introduction, to Jeremy, and to all our wonderful participants. And we're looking forward to hearing from you today. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. It is also my pleasure to meet you personally, knowing the other members of your family. And I too look forward to getting to know you better in the future. Allow me to tell everybody who is listening in, watching in, that originally when I was indicated my happiness to be able to make this presentation, I thought we were going to begin at 7 o'clock and then we would end in time for the siren that goes off here in Israel at 8 o'clock in the evening, this evening, in memory of the fallen defenders of our state, those who sacrificed their lives in order that Israel may be established and may be secure. But in fact, what now, in terms of the time frame, it's going to be right in the middle. And as Wendy and I were saying in a conversation prior to the beginning of this webinar, that probably is quite serendipitous or providential, whichever term you prefer, so that it will enable us to bring the Israeli reality also into our webinar in the course of the presentation and subsequent discussion. So at 8 o'clock, I will hear the siren going off as it goes off around the country here, and I will stand and we will have a minute's silence, and then I will recommence wherever I have left off from. So in terms of the subject that I've been mandated to discuss, the Vatican's relationship with the Jewish people, and I would say, in other words, that means with the Jewish people and Israel, since the Second World War, since the period of the Shoah, in order to be able to look at this in context, I need to take you back to 1904. 1904, there was a gentleman whom you will all have heard of by the name of Theodor Herzl, who was hawking his wares around Europe, trying to get the various leaders, potentates, monarchs to support the idea of a national home for the Jewish people in our ancestral homeland. And he managed to get a meeting with the Pope at that time, who was Pope Pius X, in 1904, some only 5 months before he died. And he recalls that meeting in his diaries. And there in his edited diaries, you can see his report on this encounter and the conversation that was held. And he presented to Pius X his vision, hoping that the Pope would see the establishment of a Jewish national home as something that would be advantageous to the Catholic Church, to the Christian world. Theodor Herzl clearly did not have a very extensive knowledge of Catholic Christian theology. Of course, he didn't have a great knowledge of Jewish thought either, but nevertheless, he was a remarkably determined individual. And he goes and he presents his position to the Pope, and he recalls to his consternation the response that Pius X gave him. Pius X said to him, "I cannot recognize you, for you have not recognized our Lord. I cannot prevent the Jews from returning to Palestine, but if you do, our priests will be there ready with holy water to baptize them all." Now, this sounds to us very shocking today, but the truth of the matter is that Pius X wasn't a particularly nasty piece of work. Most popes wouldn't have given Theodor Herzl the time of day. He at least graciously received him. He was simply articulating what had been normative Catholic theology, normative Christian theology, which was that the Jews had failed to recognize the Christian dispensation. They had therefore been cast out of their land, their temple destroyed, exiled and pushed from pillar to post precisely because of that failure. And in fact, in order to explain why the Jews continue to exist if they'd been superseded by the church, theologians like Augustine said that Jews remain precisely in their homelessness and in their own suffering to testify to what happens to you when you don't accept the Christian dispensation. Therefore, Jewish homelessness became something almost built in to Christian theology. Therefore, Pius was simply telling Herzl what was their belief, which was that the Jews could not be accepted by the church as a sovereign entity in their ancestral homeland for as long as they did not accept the Christian message. Now, even if there were those that wanted to approach that in a more benevolent way, obviously it leads to a terrible perception of Jews, a degradation of Jews, and even a dehumanization. Because if you say the Jews reject the essential message for the benefit of humanity, and they reject God's plan, then you start presenting the Jews as not just the enemies of the church, but as the enemies of God, and therefore in league with the devil, and therefore responsible for all the terrible things that happen in the world. And this theology became described by a great scholar who played a critical role, which perhaps I'll have the opportunity to mention in a transformation in the relations between the Catholic Church and the Jewish people, the French Jewish historian Julie Zac, referred to as the teaching of contempt, enseignement de prix, which in French. But we use the term teaching of contempt now normatively to describe this particular approach of the church towards the Jewish people. And this attitude was used to justify, if not direct assault against Jews, at least the turning of the, giving the cold shoulder, turning the back on Jews, the attitude that says if Jews suffered, they deserved it. And this whole approach, of course, culminated in the greatest of all tragedies. It's not that the Nazi final solution was a Christian campaign. It wasn't. In fact, in many ways, we can argue that and there's enough evidence to testify to that the Nazism was inherently hostile towards Christianity and was about to target Christianity in many different ways. In fact, we know that there were assassination plans designed on the Pope during the period of the Shoah as well. But nevertheless, while the Shoah was above all a Jewish tragedy, not only a Jewish tragedy, of course, but above all a Jewish tragedy, it was a Christian scandal because it was perpetrated by ostensibly baptized Christians in ostensibly Christian lands. And this, of course, led to a fascinating process as the realities of that horrific period started dawning with greater impact upon the Catholic Church in particular, but the Christian world as a whole, and of course ramifications even beyond that. In the periods of the greatest darkness, there is often to be found great light, and of course there were great heroes during the period of the Shoah. And we should not forget that 90%, if not more, of Hasidei Umot Ha'olam, the righteous of the Gentiles that saved Jews during that period, were also professing Christians. And the vast majority believing that what they did to save Jewish lives was precisely mandated by their faith and their religious heritage. But amongst the most notable personalities during this terrible period was the man who was the Vatican's legate in Turkey at the time, a roly-poly prelate by the name of Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli. Roncalli was amongst the first to be able to get messages conveyed by Jewish emissaries, often secretly spirited out of Central and Eastern Europe, of the Nazi killing machine. And he did bring the information, and that's pretty clear, to the attention of his superiors, which of course meant also Pope Pius XII, the Pope during the period of the Shoah. But more than that, when he realized that for whatever reasons, he was not going to get the kind of support that he had hoped for from the Holy See, he started taking initiatives himself. And many initiatives of which we know and which are well documented, not least of all, he had been previously in Bulgaria. He had a profound influence on King Boris, unquestionably played a critical role in King Boris's resolve not to collaborate with the Nazis. But perhaps most dramatically, Roncalli started issuing false baptismal certificates at a time when Jews could escape the clutches of the Nazis if they could show that they had become baptized Christians. This was a very relatively limited period of time. Now, for us within the Jewish community, a baptismal certificate, that's another piece of paper. But for a Catholic, it's not just another piece of paper. For Catholics, there are aspects of religious life that are called sacraments, which are intrinsically holy, and baptism is a sacrament. To issue a false baptismal certificate would normally be considered a travesty. But Roncalli was determined to do everything he could to save lives, to save Jewish lives. And he issued these false baptismal certificates and did indeed save many thousands of lives. There are many other stories of his role. Incidentally, after his position and after the war, he was appointed as the nuncio, the papal ambassador in France, and played a critical role during the vote at the United Nations that led to the establishment of the State of Israel in enlisting Catholic countries, particularly Latin American countries, to support the United Nations resolution. Roncalli had not been especially highly regarded as an intellect or as a theologian. And therefore, after Pius XII, the Pope during the period of the Shoah, died, to many people's surprise, the conclave elected as his successor Archbishop Roncalli, who took the name John the 23rd. And he was a pope for only a brief time, but he proved to be not just, as many expected, and maybe those who voted for him thought, just a mild caretaker. He proved to be a revolutionary. He understood that the Catholic Church, to use his own language, was basically captured by cobwebs of history, and that it needed to have a complete refreshing. He used the terms, open the doors, let the fresh air in. The term he used was aggiornamento, updating the church, bringing it into the modern world. One of the things that he wanted to do, amongst so many others, was to address the whole problem of this teaching of contempt. Because Roncalli, like many others, and there are many other wonderful names, many of whom had understood this before the Second World War, but the impact of the Shoah led to a remarkable cheshbon nefesh, reckoning of the soul, amongst many people who recognized it as in fact a perversion of authentic original Christian teaching, something which surely Jesus of Nazareth, as a loyal Jew, would have been absolutely horrified to know that was being argued, let alone perpetrated in his name. And he himself was felt strongly about that. Unquestionably, the meeting he had with the French Jewish historian Jules Isaac, who documented all the different aspects of this negative teaching of contempt towards the Jews and its consequences, had a profound impact too. And he gave a mandate to Cardinal Bayer, a German cardinal, to start developing a document that would address the whole relationship with the Jewish people. Prior to that, he had already changed certain things within the liturgy. There had been a phrase used in the Triduum in the 3 days leading up to Easter, which has just been celebrated, where there was a prayer that used to exist for the perfidious Jew, that God's compassion and saving grace be vouchsafed to the perfidious Jew. He eliminated the term perfidious. There's also a famous story of how, when passing the synagogue in Rome on Lungo Tevere, on one Shabbat morning, he saw Jews going to prayer, and he got out of his car and he blessed them. And all kinds of other stories that show that this was a man who deeply felt not only the pain of Jewish history, but the burden of guilt on the church for its own particular role in the tragedies that had befallen the Jewish people. The process he set in motion led to the promulgation of a document within the Second Vatican Council in 1965 by the name of Nostra Aetate. Vatican documents are, lahavdil, like the Jewish portions of the week. The opening word, or the central word of the opening sentence, is the name of the document. And the document that is known as Nostra Aetate opens with those words, "in our times." And the whole story of this document and exactly what's in it and how it came about is a fascinating story in and of itself. We don't have the time now to go into that in detail, but though I'm very happy if people want to take me into it in greater depth in the question time, if we have time available. The most important thing is that the central component, clause 4, dealing with the relationship with the Jewish people, says a number of dramatic things. First of all, it says that any attempt to present the Jews as cursed or rejected by God is wrong. In other words, in one fell swoop, condemning what had been normative Christian theology towards the Jews. And it affirmed that the covenant between God and the Jewish people has never been broken, that God does not repent of his gifts. That's a quote coming from Paul. But to be able to utilize that in a Vatican document to say that there is still a covenant between God and the Jewish people was really remarkable. For many people, the most remarkable aspect of it was its repudiation of the deicide charge, that the idea that Jews were somehow particularly guilty for the death of Jesus and therefore bore that guilt in perpetuity is a perversion of authentic Christian teaching. In fact, it wasn't too difficult to do that theologically, because already the Council of Trent some few hundred years ago, before that, had already indicated that Jesus' death was to be seen as, if you like, the responsibility of all humanity. And of course, from a Christian point of view, that death was an atoning sacrifice and therefore was seen something as part of the divine plan. Therefore, the whole idea of apportioning Jewish guilt in perpetuity didn't really make sense. This document, however, was categorical in rejecting that, because even if it didn't make sense, people had used that as an argument to harm Jews and to perform atrocities against Jews. So this was an important statement. The document also condemned anti-Semitism by anyone at any level, interesting language, and at any time. So this was the beginning of a remarkable revolution in terms of Catholic-Jewish relations and in terms of the approach of the Vatican towards the Jewish people. And we must give copyright to John Paul II, even though he did not live to see the promulgation of that document. It was promulgated by a successor, Pope Paul VI, who was, of course, the first pope to visit Israel, not an official state visit. And there were complexities and difficulties in relation to that visit, but nevertheless, he did visit Israel and did meet with Israeli elected officials. And of course, the next real level, however, came in the election of the subsequent pope. In other words, after Pope Paul VI, there was John Paul I, who only lived a few months, and he was succeeded by the first ever non-Italian Polish Pope, Karol Wojtyła, who took the name John Paul II. And before I get to John Paul II, let me just say that in the wake of Nostra Aetate, first of all, the Vatican established a formal commission for religious relations with Jewry, and therefore opened an official dialogue with the Jewish community. All the different Jewish organizations, or so many different Jewish organizations and Jewish streams, denominations, sought to become the interlocutors. Eventually, the Vatican said, can't you get your act together? And as a result of Vatican request, all the Jewish organizations formed themselves into something called the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations. The acronym is IJCIC. I like to say, because it's made up of competing Jewish organizations, as well as the different streams of Judaism, it's an appropriate acronym because it's continuously itching and kicking. And I had the honor to twice be the chairman of this particular body, which is not a simple body, but nevertheless is significant, was the only official interlocutor prior to 2003. And I'll get there in due course. But this international body representing the Jewish world and the Vatican, through its Commission for Religious Relations with Jewry, established a liaison committee that met regularly and has had formal consultations every 2 years around topics of science and society, but above all dealing with issues on the agenda of concern both to the Jewish community as well as to the Holy See. John, there were documents that came out subsequently after Nostra Aetate, very important documents that further developed the ideas that are there in Nostra Aetate, developed how one document in 74 was called the Guidelines on Nostra Aetate. Another document came out in 85 was called the Notes on the Preaching and Teaching and Catechesis Concerning Jews and Judaism. Another document that came out that condemned not only anti-Semitism, but also anti-Zionism that serves as a guide for anti-Semitism was called the Church and Racism. And there was a document that was also issued with regards to the Shoah. It was a very important document, recognizing, if you like, a certain responsibility, maybe not satisfying enough to the Jewish community. Perhaps what was a source of a certain irritation for many was the attempt to what many saw as a whitewash of the record of Pius XII. I hope to come to that in due course. But nevertheless, it was still a very important statement with regards to anti-Semitism. And then there were the statements of John Paul II himself, his remarkable visit to the synagogue in Rome in 1986. Most people don't know about documents and don't read documents, but people do read newspapers, and above all, they watch television. And to see the Pope going to the synagogue, embracing Rabbi Toaf and speaking of the Jewish people as a dearly beloved elder brother of the church, that obviously had an impact way beyond the own particular location and demonstrated that something of a sea change had taken place in terms of the Catholic Church's approach towards the Jewish people. For all those achievements and for all those remarkable documents, there was still somehow some lingering doubt in the Jewish mind, and maybe even within Catholic minds, as to how fully sincere this transformation really was within the Catholic Church. Obviously, in the end, we all look and judge things according to our own particular parochial interests and perspectives. And from a Jewish perspective, in this era, which we are about to celebrate, and as I say, this evening, to commemorate the sacrifices that were made in order to bring about that celebration of the establishment and the security of the State of Israel, not to have a diplomatic relationship, if you are a political diplomatic entity with the State of Israel, seemed to be rather problematic. It suggested to many Jews that perhaps the attitude of Pius X, as expressed to Theodor Herzl, still lingered in certain quarters. The Vatican sought to impress upon its Jewish interlocutors that this was not the case, and there was no theological objection to full diplomatic relations with Israel. The concerns were only political. And to some extent, one can understand that. One must bear in mind that the local church here in Israel, in the Holy Land, in the Middle East, is an Arab church. Its interests are above all within the midst of the Arab majority. It therefore can't afford to be seen to be disloyal to Arab causes, and it has to be very cautious as to how it navigates its own particular interests. I remember when we celebrated the 25th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, walking across St. Peter's together with the cardinal who was in charge of relations with the Jewish people at the time, Cardinal Willebrands, a Dutchman. And I said to him, Your Eminence, if you say there are no theological objections, you're saying then, in fact, the concerns are political, and that you are worried that there could be consequences for your communities in the Arab and in the Muslim world at large. Do you really think that that is a serious concern? And he said to me, not only is it a serious concern, we have received direct threats that if we do anything in relation to Israel, our communities and our churches will suffer the consequences. What changed things in relation to Israel was the Madrid Peace Conference of 1991. And in the wake of that peace conference, the Vatican started reaching out to Israel. And I will give you a very interesting anecdote, as I was present at the press conference in Rome when the establishment of the bilateral commission between the State of Israel and the Holy See was announced. I was very honored to be involved by Israel in the little team of 5 people that negotiated the establishment of full relations between the Vatican and Israel. Our foreign ministry, like probably most foreign ministries in the world, is generally made up of people who think they know everything about everything. But the one thing they might acknowledge they don't know everything about is religion. And there was a recognition on the other side of the table were not only diplomats and legal experts, but men of the cloth. And therefore, it would be a good idea if on the Jewish side, there was somebody who at least knows the difference between a Catholic and a Protestant, if not between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. So as a result, I was the beneficiary, if you like, of this absence. And I was very honored to be part of the team. And it was a fascinating process, negotiating and establishing it. And that was also a whole lecture and a presentation in itself of what was involved and what was the process of negotiating the establishment of full diplomatic relations. The bottom line, however, was that at the end of 1993, we signed the fundamental agreement establishing full diplomatic relations between the Vatican and Israel. At the beginning of 1994, ambassadors were exchanged, and we've had about 10 exchanges of ambassadors since then. And therefore, there are full and open relations and communication. One of the very important factors in this establishment of these, excuse me, allow me to backtrack. So I was going to mention to you what was said at the press conference by the Vatican spokesperson at the time, Mr. Joaquin Navarro Valls. And he was asked, why are you now talking with Israel? And he said, look, you've just seen the Madrid Peace Conference. All the Arab nations and even the Palestinians are talking with the Israelis. Why shouldn't we? And that was an amazing admission. I mean, in a sense, it was rather a self-indictment. After all, the Catholic Church claims to be a moral presence in the world. You expect it to lead rather than just follow. But at least it was better than not doing anything. But it was an acknowledgement that what had prevented them from establishing diplomatic relations with Israel were their concerns in the Arab world and in the Muslim world at large. And now that there were therefore negotiations with Israel, they felt that they could move ahead to not only to do the right thing, but also to negotiate how they could protect their communities here and their assets and their interests in relation to Israeli law. And that was the concord that was signed, known as the Fundamental Agreement at the end of 1993, and then led to the full exchange of ambassadors. Another very important byproduct of this was the establishment of a bilateral commission, which I will tell you about very shortly, because the siren has just started. May the memory of all those that sacrificed their lives, and many who sacrificed limb and so much for the establishment of the State of Israel and to protect us and to guarantee its security, may their memory always be for a blessing. So one of the byproducts of the establishment of the fundamental agreement was the ability of Pope John Paul II to fulfill a passionate desire of his to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land as the Pope in the year 2000. I referred earlier to the fact that Pope Paul VI had visited Israel, but not as an official visit. And he had passed through, and there was a feeling, in a sense, after the visit, there were great hopes that this would lead to some change. And maybe indeed Pope Paul VI was testing the waters, and the negative reactions from within the Arab world convinced him that this wasn't the right time to move ahead. But at any rate, Israel felt that they had been a little bit cheated, or treated rather shabbily. And it was clear to Pope John Paul II that there was no way he would be able to make his pilgrimage to the Holy Land if this was not going to be a full state visit. And you couldn't have a full state visit if there were not full diplomatic relations between the Holy See and the State of Israel. So this was another reason for him pushing hard on the establishment of full diplomatic relations, to a large degree against the will of the political structure within the Vatican, known as the Secretariat of State. I'm happy also to elaborate upon that, but I don't want to do so right at this particular moment. That visit in the year 2000 was dramatic. I said before that the impact of the visit of the Pope to the synagogue in the year 1986 had a profound impact. But it was nothing like his visit to Israel in the year 2000. And there the world saw amazing images, and Israel saw amazing images. I would say, even from a personal point of view, you know, up till that time, I would not say that there was very significant Orthodox involvement in the area of interfaith relations. There have been some notable individuals, particularly in Europe, and one or two also in North America, but the vast majority of interfaith practitioners and pioneers and people who had led the way had come from the liberal movements of Judaism, and Orthodoxy had generally remained rather suspicious. But the impact of the papal visit really changed perceptions and had an impact also upon Orthodox communities around the world, because it had an impact upon Orthodoxy within Israel. To see the Pope already now a prisoner of his body, and rather sick, a victim of Parkinson's and ossification of his muscles, of his limbs, to see him in tearful solidarity with Jewish suffering at Yad Vashem, laying their wreaths and discovering stories of how he saved people during the period of the Shoah as a novice, and how when he became a bishop, required Polish Catholic families to return Jewish children whom they had baptized and absorbed into their families back to their original Jewish parents. All these stories blew people's minds here. And to see him at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, putting there the text of a service of repentance that he had composed that took place a few weeks earlier in the Vatican, asking God's forgiveness for all the sins committed by Christians against Jews down the ages, had an amazing effect upon people's perception of the Christian world and his attitude towards Jews, Judaism, and towards the State of Israel. During this amazing visit, and it was a great privilege of me to be involved in that, as I had been involved in the visits of subsequent popes, he, at his initiative, chose to meet with the Council of the Chief Rabbinate of Israel. And he met with the chief rabbis and members of their council, and he said at that meeting, you know, there is a body that represents the Jewish world, but I would like to have a formal, direct relationship with the Chief Rabbinate of Israel, a formal bilateral commission of the Chief Rabbinate of Israel with the Holy See. This was not a simple request. I understand that most, if not all of you, know my brother. We are Orthodox rabbis, but I would describe us as modern Orthodox rabbis. We are comfortable in the secular world. Hopefully we know how to discriminate between the good things in the secular world and the not so good things. But we find our, if you're right, our direction within a milieu that we do not find threatening. On the contrary, we find it very enriching. the vast majority of our colleagues within the rabbinic establishment in Israel don't even have a proper secular education, and they don't really feel comfortable within the world outside their own 4 cubits of Jewish studies and learning. And the chief rabbinate of Israel doesn't have a committee for dialogue with other kinds of Jews. They never thought of having a committee for a dialogue with another religion. But when a pope comes along and says to you, this is what I'd like, it's rather difficult to say no. So once again, as with the story I was telling about the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, here I become the beneficiary of other people's limitations, because the chief rabbinate therefore needs somebody who knows what he's doing in terms of relationships, therefore, with the Catholic institutions, with the Vatican. And as a result, a commission was established that was originally chaired by the late Chief Rabbi of Haifa, Rabbi Shai Yashuv Cohen, but became very reliant on me as its resource person, as a member of that commission, in terms of the content of the meetings, which have taken place since then every year until Corona, 1 year in Rome, 1 year in Jerusalem. The Anglican Church became a little bit jealous and asked also to have a bilateral commission. We have every year until Corona a meeting, 1 year in Canterbury or in Lambeth, and 1 year in Jerusalem. And a number of areas of engagement within Chief Rabbinate emerged out of a number of factors, but most significantly out of that particular initiative of John Paul II. That bilateral commission has been very important also for diplomatic and political goals. So I mentioned to you earlier the framework of ICHKIC, the International Jewish Committee, which represents all the bodies, AJC, the American Jewish Committee, ADL, the World Jewish Congress, the RCA and OU, the Orthodox bodies in America, the RA and the Conservative Judaism and the Conservative Movement, the Reform Rabbinic and lay bodies, and there is therefore an Israeli representation all within that. But now a new player came on the scene, and that was the Chief Rabbinate of Israel. And for all its limitations, it became the avenue by which we are able to get far further, far quicker with the Vatican than we were through the more international bodies, because we had, through this framework, access to the Secretariat of State, as I say, the engine, the political power, center of power within the Vatican. And so, for example, when there was the famous brouhaha over what appeared to be Pope Benedict XVI's acceptance of Bishop Williamson from a breakaway group back into the Catholic Church, and his anti-Semitic attitudes and pronouncements were discovered, we were able to act on that primarily because of the rapidity of the response from the Commission of the Chief Rabbinate. There are other examples I can give where it's been a very important tool, not only in terms of developing dialogue, but in terms of facilitating access for issues that need to be addressed in real time. But it has had a significant impact, not least of all upon the rabbis who've been involved, rabbis who before had never met Christians and who had very, if I would say, stereotypical misunderstandings with regards to Christianity. And these people are multiplicators, and therefore it impacts upon their own particular communities. So it's been a very interesting process. Of course, John Paul II, in addition to his visit to Israel and his visit to synagogue in Rome, also went to Auschwitz, issued very important pronouncements condemning anti-Semitism as a sin against God and man, and has been followed in these by both Pope Benedict XVI and by Pope Francis, who have all followed in his footsteps in a visit to the synagogue in Rome, in their pilgrimage to Israel, their respect to Israel's highest elected officials, both political and religious, paying homage to the victims of the Shoah at Auschwitz, condemning anti-Semitism as a sin incompatible with true Christian belief. Pope Francis, as I said, has followed in those footsteps and has done likewise. And Pope Francis is remarkable in that he's really the first Pope ever who has really known intimately Jewish life. John Paul II did grow up with many Jewish friends, and in the town of Watowice, where he grew up, a third of the town were Jewish. But by the time he reached the age of majority, the Shoah had devastated the Jewish community, as well as Poland generally, but had devastated the Jewish community, and therefore he didn't really know Jewish life as an adult. Pope Francis, as the cardinal in Buenos Aires, not only had close Jewish friendships and wrote a book together with a rabbi, but opened up a cathedral for Shoah, Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Day commemorations, have visited synagogues on the High Holy Days and on Hanukkah, and therefore is the first ever Pope, unless you want to identify Peter as the first Pope of, who was of course a Jew, with that familiarity, but he's really the first Pope really to be truly familiar with the Jewish world, and as I say, has reinforced these commitments, this dramatic change. So we've gone to a situation of where to recognize the Jewish people, to affirm that the covenant between God is positive, and that God's love of the Jewish people continues, and that the Jewish people therefore is not only entitled, but that in fact its return to its ancestral homeland is seen as a sign of God's fidelity and faithfulness to his promise, from seeing these things as an anathema, which is a dramatic transformation. To have seen somebody yesterday as rejected, cursed by God, and today we affirm him as a dearly beloved elder brother of the church, of the original covenant, never broken and never to be broken. That's Pope John Paul II's actual phraseology. That's stunning. You know, there are cultures or attitudes or approaches which have gone from, if you like, negative to not so negative. But to have gone from such a demonization of a particular people and religious tradition to such a positive relationship today, where these three popes that I've mentioned have all said our relationship with the Jewish people is a relationship like that which we have with no other. It is intrinsic to our own identity, and that we cannot be true Christians if we do not respect and we do not revere the Jewish roots of the Christian heritage. And of course, you have all the educational programs to be able to introduce Christians to the understanding of the Jewishness of Jesus and of the apostles. There's still an enormous amount of work to be done. It would be ridiculous to claim that we have eliminated anti-Semitism within the Christian world. Obviously not. But today, if you are openly an anti-Semite, you will not be made a bishop. And I can give you examples of where that's precisely the case. That's already a very significant achievement. And as my late great colleague, Dr. Jeffrey Wigeder once put it, today the church is far more part of the solution than it is part of the problem. There are still issues, and if I would have had more time, I would also speak about Jewish responses and Jewish documents in response, but I want to leave some time for questions and answers and some discussion. There are some issues that remain on the table, but most of these are born out of Vatican realpolitik. The Vatican is a political and diplomatic entity. It has to advance its own particular interests. This inevitably means that it faces certain moral dilemmas. Its approach to China is a classic example. In order to be able to preserve the church in China, it feels it can't openly condemn the human rights abuses to the degree that it should in China, even though there have been some muted remarks. And therefore, very often, the moral positions that we would expect are compromised. This often relates also to the Middle East, where it has to take into account the needs and the interests of its own particular communities. The one last matter I will refer to is, of course, the question of the opening of the archives, which have been opened for scholarly review, the archives from the period of the Second World War, which have been made available earlier than they normally are. There is normally actually a double regnum wait until the pontificates, previous pontificates are examined in terms of the archival material. Already Pope Benedict XVI indicated that he would hasten the access to the archival material for scholars, and Pope Francis has set that in motion. Obviously, the pandemic of the last year and a quarter has led to a certain suspension, but there is more and more scholarly research taking place in that regard. In my opinion, while it's really important to look at the archival material to be able to see exactly what was done and what was not done, it's not going to resolve, I don't believe that anything will resolve the cardinal question. If you'll excuse the pun, that was an unintentional pun. And the cardinal question really is a hypothetical one in relation to Pius XII. For Jews, for Catholics, a pope is not just another fellow. And they believe that there is a popular misconception that anything the Pope does or says is automatically kosher, is automatically divinely sanctioned. That is incorrect. Speaking ex cathedra, which means that he speaks with the capacity of infallibility, only relates to specific doctrine when the Pope speaks on Catholic doctrine. Otherwise, he's considered to be a fallible human being like all of us. But nevertheless, for Catholics, it's still a Pope. And most Catholics really believe that Pope Pius XII made a legitimate, calculated decision that to directly confront the Nazis would do more harm than good. And they would say there is enough evidence to indicate that he supported so many efforts to be able to save Jews during that particular period. From a Jewish perspective, the idea that anything could be seen as better than worse is outrageous. What could have been worse? And even if Pope Pius XII could not have stopped the Nazi death machine, to at least issue a forthright condemnation that was totally unambiguous would have offered some at least sense of succor, some sense of greater hope to Jews languishing in the camps and facing the shadow of death. So there is, if you like, an unbridgeable chasm in terms of perceptions in this regard. But there is also a hypothetical question which will not be resolved. To some extent, the question that we are debating is, if he would have done what he could have done but didn't do, would it have been different? Could it have been different? And I don't think we're ever going to resolve that. If ever there was a smoking gun that would show that there was some kind of direct collaboration between the Vatican and the Nazis, unquestionably that would have been removed a long time and is not going to be found in any archival material. So I don't think that anybody who is expecting anything like that is going to find any kind of satisfaction. There are already, and there will be, many revelations which will be embarrassing for the Vatican with regards to specific prelates who did collaborate. But there will also be stories of great heroism and great selflessness that was also exhibited during that particular period. So history is a mixed bag, but there is no question that we live in a remarkable era in which today the institution that historically had been the major force of the delegitimization of the Jewish people, even the demonization of Jewish people, today is a force not only for promoting understanding, dialogue, and mutual respect with the Jewish people, but affirming a unique relationship and a unique sense of responsibility for that relationship. And it's been a great privilege, and is a great privilege still, for me to be able to play some small part in that remarkable historical transformation. So I now bring my monologue to an end, and I will be very happy to respond to any particular questions.
Thank you, Rabbi Rosen. That was absolutely brilliant. And I've been flicking through the questions, and at least half of them are saying how much they're appreciating your talk. And before we get on to the seriousness, there's a very sweet note from Tom O'Higgins, who knew you in Dublin and wanted to tell you that his family adopted your cat, and it had a long and lovely life. And also there's quite a few people who've known you on your travels in South Africa and Dublin who are listening in. You might like to know there are over 2,500 machines listening to you this evening. And also there's been a lot of appreciation for the minute silence. So thank you so much for doing that. And as you might expect, many of the questions, there's a lot of appreciation for the work you're doing, but there's a lot of issues over Pius XII. And Arlene Goldberg has asked, what's happened to the attempt to actually canonize him?
So thank you very much. That's a really important question. So there is an internal process in the Catholic Church with regard to making somebody a saint. And interestingly, from the Catholic point of view, somebody becoming a saint does not necessarily mean that everything in their life was saintly or that everything they did was okay. The essential requirement from a Catholic internal canonic perspective is that two miracles can be demonstrated to have been performed either by or in the name of or through the intercession of the individual who becomes made a saint. And therefore, this is, if you like, not if you like, this is an internal theological religious procedure within the Catholic Church. And it's not the business of the Jewish people to tell the Catholic Church who its saints are, just as we don't want them to tell us exactly what should be within our own particular religious tradition. But nevertheless, what we can say and what we should say and what we must say and what we have said is that if you say you want to live in a relationship now of mutual respect, then you need to take into account our sensitivities and our sensibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And that even if the record with regards to Pius XII is disputed, you would appreciate how painful it is for the Jewish people. And that to go ahead and make him a saint would be seen as a slap in our face. Now, it seems that this argument has been well taken because there has been a confirmation of one miracle, and it's actually Pope Francis who has taken the process further. Both John Paul II and especially Benedict XVI were very sensitive not to take the process further out of concern for Jewish sensibilities. I must say in parenthesis that what worries me is that precisely because Pope Francis is seen as such a good friend of the Jewish people and is so popular, that might be exploited precisely to facilitate moving the canonization of Pope Pius XII ahead. I think that to try to argue on the question of the historical record on our point is a very difficult task, and it's not one that we will succeed with. Therefore, my comments to Pope Francis, for which I got a curt nod, but not much more than that, was not to say to him, look, this is a matter of dispute and a historical record, and we have got to look at all the archives before we can come to a decision, because in the end, they might well say, and they might be able to say, we've opened the archives, we've looked at everything, there is really nothing that can categorically condemn it. He did try to do his best in his own particular way. We consider him to have been a man who performed miracles, and therefore he is worthy of being called a saint. And we won't be able to win in that particular debate. But what I think we can argue, and what I did argue, and what I think we should argue rather than the question of the historical debate, is that for as long as there are still survivors with us, as long as there are people who still bear the scars of this most horrific of eras, it is your responsibility, out of respect for our sensibilities, not to move ahead and to continue to freeze this process.
I think you really opened you've answered Izzy Pima's question, because he's asking whether you believe the opening of the archives will actually clarify the situation. And basically you're saying not. I remember my colleague Robert Wistrich was one of the historians originally in, and he made very public statements that he didn't believe there would ever be access to what they needed to see.
Right, and I think that he has been proven wrong in as much as there is much more access now, and that access to all the historical material has been provided. But I still say again, I don't think it's going to resolve the questions. And again, if ever there was any kind of smoking gun, it would have been removed a long, long time ago.
Yeah. You have a very interesting question on the Vatican's reaction to Mussolini's anti-Jewish laws.
Well, I'm not an expert on that, but I do know that there have been a number of conferences, already one initiated by John Paul II, which were to basically affirm a mea culpa and the degree to which there was collaboration between church leadership and Mussolini. So I think that this is part and parcel of a positive historical revisionism that's taken place within the Catholic Church. And certainly with regards to the racial laws as they pertain to the Jewish people, there's no question that is seen as a terrible blot on Italy's history, and therefore on the church to the degree that it was party to it.
There's a lovely statement from Mira Ross. Evidently the IPO played for Pius XII, and her father was the leader, and he actually made a speech on behalf of the Jewish people, and he himself came from Vienna and was a pupil of Huberman. So that it's absolutely superb, Rabbi Rosen, just how many interesting people and interested people.
And allow me to mention that at that particular event, it's very interesting. I don't know whether it was her father or exactly who it was, expressed thanks of the Jewish people for the efforts that Pope Pius XII made during the period of the Shoah. More than that, when Pius XII died, Golda Meir sent him a message, sent a message to the Vatican, mourning the death of Pius XII, and again extolling his actions to be able to save Jews during that particular period. Therefore, we have a number of significant actors who did perceive, who didn't, or let me say it differently, who did not perceive Pope Pius XII's record as something that was a calumny, something condemnable. And therefore the defenders of Pius XII would only say that after Rolf Hochhuth's play, the can't remember the name now. Can anybody remember?
It was very controversial, I think. Yes. It's gone. I'm sure one of our viewers will give us the name.
So after Rolf Hochhuth's play, so there became a much more open discussion of it and a more critical approach. But then many would say that was also because there was much more willingness to confront the enormity of the tragedy and to be more critical of the players at that particular time. So at any rate, the point is there is a mixed bag here. It's never going to be satisfactory from our perspective, but it will be misleading to present this as in some way absolutely black and white.
You've got a very strong statement from Audrey Travis, who asks, is there any initiative by the Vatican to rewrite or rephrase certain anti-Semitic passages in the Gospels?
That's also a very important question. Now, let us be self-reflective a little bit. Not all passages within the Tanakh are those with which we would want to identify today. And not all actions taken in the periods of ancient Jewish scriptural history are those. What do we do about them as Jews, especially if we are Orthodox Jews that take our texts very seriously, and if we seek to be morally sensitive human beings at the same time? What we do is we contextualize them. We put them in their context, in their time and place, and explain them so that they have no direct bearing upon any contemporary reality. Now, that's what the Catholic Church is doing. It's not doing it effectively enough, because you will still come across many parts of the world where they will read their scriptures without contextualizing. But the documents that I referred to in my presentation, and in many places, especially where there is positive interaction between the church and the Jewish people, not least of all in North America, those passages that are used with any kind of liturgical context, such as Easter time, are presented contextually. And one of the most important things to do in that regard is to make it clear to the audience that the debates that appear in the New Testament are debates between Jews and Jews. That Jesus was a Jew and the apostles were Jews. And that the authorities very often that they were interacting with were often the authorities that most of our ancestors, who we tend to see as the Pharisees, also had problems with, namely the Sadducees, who were to a large degree the collaborators with the Romans. When you put it within context and you understand these debates as internal debates, it's very similar to debates that take place within a Talmud, where very often one rabbi can be scathing and even derogatory about another, and then they'll get up and they'll have a l'chaim together, and they wouldn't have any problem with their daughters and their sons getting married together and living together. That was a kind of discourse. Very often this kind of discourse that appears in the New Testament seems to us to be shocking because it's so aggressive. But as I say, our sages often refer to one another as snakes and vipers. So it's not something that new. It's a need to be able to contextualize it and to present it and to understand what is being said, when it's being said, and by whom it's being said. And that process is increasing. I think if we would try to force anyone, and even succeed in getting peoples to expunge passages of sacred scripture, it would come back to haunt us. It would boomerang. It is much more effective to try to contextualize and explain why something is being said, when it's being said, and by whom it is said, than to try to eliminate it altogether.
There's quite a few questions on the evangelical aspect of Christianity, that they still believe that we are damned without the embrace of the church.
Well, so something I should have said even earlier, because we can't even really, we can generalize more about the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church has a magisterium, that is, it has a central authority. And therefore there is an official doctrine and there is an official body that determines doctrine. But that is relatively, I would say, pretty unique even within the Christian world. The vast majority of the Christian world is far more diverse and diffuse. The term evangelical embraces a very broad spectrum.
Yeah.
Embraces a broad spectrum politically, not only theologically. So you have elements, obviously, which have required far more media attention that would be associated politically with Donald Trump and more militant elements within the Republican Party. But you also have left-wing evangelical movements and organizations like the Sojourners in Washington, D.C., until recently led by Jim Wallace. Bear in mind also that both Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter are evangelicals. So you've got a broad spectrum of evangelical Christianity. I think what the questioner is particularly directing us to is what in theological language, if you'll excuse me getting a little bit esoteric here, is called premillennial dispensationalism. A view of the Bible as a roadmap, and that we are entering a period of the end of days. And within that perception, Israel is seen as playing a very significant role, because the ingathering of the exiles is seen as a preparation for the building of the third temple, to enable Jesus to come back as prophesied to a newly built Jerusalem. And then everybody either converts to Christianity or gets wiped out. And that isn't a terribly appetizing prospect for us. So this leads to, so that kind of dispensationalism, that kind of evangelical dispensationalism tends to be very supportive of Israel, but still tends to bring with it certain more traditional anti-Judaic tropes. Yeah. I use the term anti-Judaic because I don't think it's fair to automatically identify it as anti-Semitic. Sometimes it can be, but not always. But that's a problem. And my biggest gripe with those Israeli politicians that embrace with such alacrity some of these evangelical leaders who have that theology is that it's simply lacking in self-respect. I'm not saying to reject them. I don't think Israel can afford to be too choosy about who's willing to support it in terms of the real world in which we live. But nevertheless, you should be honest and open about it, about what you do agree and what you don't agree. And don't give your interlocutor the impression that you are a partner in terms of their end of days agenda. But make it clear that there are things on which you differ, and which you differ strongly, and which are part of your own self-identity and your self-respect. But there are areas in where you're willing and happy to collaborate. That is, I think, the modern way, certainly very much the American way. And I think that's a sensible way to be able to address the issue.
You'll be pleased to know that 4 people have told us the play we were looking for is The Deputy.
Thank you very much.
Now, there are a few questions about the rap line, Bishop Alwar Hudal and the rap line out of the Vatican. Do you want to comment on that?
I'm happy to do so, and to say that that is really the most condemnable area, and already John Paul II acknowledged that and did condemn it. And in terms of a conference he had with regards to the whole question of anti-Semitism in Rome, this was raised. It certainly was nurtured and fueled by anti-Judaic and downright anti-Semitic attitudes, even if that was not the main thrust. The main thrust was the totally immoral self-interest of the church to be able to advance its own interests and assets in relation to these elements and their influence and their power, and a misguided perception of what it means to maintain loyalty to the baptized, those within the particular community. This phenomenon we see amongst all religions. Very often we find, even within our own community, sometimes people are willing to cover up some of the most criminal activities simply because the individual goes to synagogue on a regular basis or may later fill in on which is outrageous. In other words, behavior that is religiously ritual but is nevertheless in conflict with fundamental ethical and moral values deserves more condemnation than even if it comes from an individual who is not ritually observant.
Well said. Now, there are a couple of questions about the children who were hidden, who were converted and hidden, and that it was difficult for them to be returned to surviving members of their families. Would you like to comment on?
This is also a matter of great debate within the Jewish community. I know I'm somebody whom I was very close to within the Jewish community would raise this regularly when he would be received in the Vatican. of the need, and indeed one of his arguments was that the importance of opening the archives was precisely to enable those people of Jewish parentage who had been adopted by Catholics and baptized as Catholics to be able to rediscover and to reunite with their Jewish roots. I must say this is a very complex matter. When you've already had it, we're already a generation apart, and one has to take into account what the consequences for many people will be for them to discover this and to be able to have their lives thrown into disarray. I think there should be the possibility of people to be able to discover if they suspect or desire to discover. But I'm not so sure as to what degree we should be pushing it to be able to bring people into a situation that could be very difficult and painful for them.
It's certainly in Poland, where there have been hundreds of people, deathbed confessions of the people they thought actually were their birth parents, so much so that it's caused terrible trauma. So it's such, as you say, Rabbi, it's such a complex issue. There's so many questions. At least half the comments, though, are saying, please come back soon, and thank you so much. But let's take just, there's a couple of questions about the controversy, the Carmelite controversy at Auschwitz. This was from Guido Smith. Would you like to comment on that?
Here again, it's a classic example of where you have, if you like, a complete breakdown of communication, a complete misunderstanding of what this means. So the nuns who went in the early 80s and established a convent to pray for the victims of the Holocaust entered a building that is debatable as to whether it can even be considered part of the actual camp of the Auschwitz work and extermination camp. It was a building that was used to store the Zyklon B gas. It was known as a theater. It was a building that existed as a theater for military soldiers before Auschwitz was turned into a concentration camp and an extermination camp. The nuns that went there didn't have any familiarity with Jews or Judaism or any understanding of what the Catholic Church might mean in terms of those historic events. So for them, they just saw their action as what they perceived as being as a religious, selfless devotion for the sake, for the cause of the victims of the tragedy. But for us, it was almost adding insult to injury. The Catholic Church we see as having failed us tragically, and even to a large degree collaborated, or at least having tilled the ground and enabled it to be so receptive to the Nazi extermination campaign. And therefore, for representatives of the church to go to that site and establish themselves there as a religious presence was seen by many within the Jewish community as horrific. And there just was, at the beginning, no meeting of minds. There was just, it was complete conversations of the deaf. There were a number of very interesting players in this, and the late Sir Sigmund Sternberg took very much the bull by the horns.
And lovely man.
Cardinal Glemp at the time, the primate in Poland, and to give him an understanding which he really didn't have until then. So we must give the late Siggy some credit in that regard. But the one who really resolved it was John Paul II, because John Paul II did understand Jewish pain and was at least, maybe not fully, but significantly sensitive to the problematics of the presence of the Carmelite convent. And he eventually instructed them, gave them an order to relocate, and suggested they relocate to a center that the Catholic Church built some distance from the Auschwitz camp as a center for prayer and study. The nuns actually did not relocate to there, but the center exists, and it performs a very important function in educating young Poles, but young Catholics from around the world about the tragedy of the Shoah and the responsibility of Christians to be able to build bridges of mutual respect with their Jewish brothers and sisters.
We got involved in that at the grassroots end because we were training teachers in Poland about the Shoah. And when it all blew up, all the priests withdrew, and it took Sir Sigmund to get in touch with Cardinal Glemp. So it's such, I think practically all the issues you're talking about, they are so intricate. I mean, there are so many of them about the hidden children, the rat line. There's a lot of pain. And there's an interesting question from Izzy Pima again. How has the Vatican dealt with the massacres and the mistreatment of Christians in the Middle East?
Well, how has it dealt with it? It's dealt with it by crying and moaning and complaining and praying, because there's very little that it can do in practical terms. It can give some form of moral succor to those communities, but the communities themselves and those who remain in those communities don't want the Vatican to take a combative position. They don't want them to be able to be seen as challenging the political powers that they have to live under. So it's a very difficult situation that they have to be able to contend with. So often it looks to us to be unsatisfactory, but it all comes back again to what I spoke about earlier, of the realpolitik, which the Vatican sees as necessary in order to be able to both protect its communities, its interests, its well-being, and what it sees as its mission.
There's 3 or 4 questions about whether you think Nostra Aetate and all the work that has gone on has actually reached grassroots level in the Catholic Church.
So that's also really a wonderful question, because changes, obviously leadership does play a critical role in changing, but it's not enough simply to be able to effect change from the top. You have to be able to ensure that these Olympian heights are internalized down onto the grassroots. And that above all means in the teaching materials and the educational materials in schools, or the formation of priests. Now, here comes a fascinating area where sociology meets theology. Where you have Jewish and Catholic communities as minorities, but nevertheless feeling as full citizens of the society, and having certain common interests and respecting their differences and strong interactions with one another, there you see that sociology facilitates an overwhelming, impressive internalization of these changes at the grassroots. And the most dramatic example of that is the United States of America. There, the relationship with the Catholic Church is so good that when the Catholic bishops deal with issues that relate to Israel, let alone any matter that relates to the Jewish people, cardinals will consult with their rabbinic colleagues to get their input for their debates. The situation is such that the educational materials of which there have been studies, one done by the late Sister Rose Steering, a more recent one done by Professor Phil Cunningham, have shown that the educational materials in Catholic parochial schools are so good, quite a few Jewish Sunday schools could do with having those kind of materials in terms of positive attitudes towards Jews, Judaism, and Israel that exist within those educational materials. On the other hand, there are parts of the world, certain parts of Latin America, certain parts of Africa where the Catholic Church is growing, Southeast Asia where the Catholic Church is also growing. Incidentally, it's growing particularly rapidly in the former Soviet Union. Many places where there is no interaction with Jewish communities, there are places where there are no Jewish communities, where they don't even feature on the radar screen. And therefore, as a result, the traditional negative tropes based upon a simplistic and decontextualized or non-contextualized reading of scripture are still there. And this continues to be the challenge where in our relationships with the Vatican, whether it's in this body Ichkik or in the bilateral commission of the Chief Rabbinate of Israel, we continue to raise this issue of the educational challenge of how do you more effectively get the educational materials down to the grassroots. One of the fascinating aspects of the Second Vatican Council is that the Vatican today rarely dictates from Rome what regional national bishops' conferences have to do. And therefore, when we'll come along and we'll say, look, what about the parochial schools? They'll say, well, we can't do that from here from Rome. What you need to do is you need to be able to get your communities to interact with the national bishops' conferences in each country to ensure that this is being done. We are prepared to support it. We are even prepared to send out letters, but it cannot be done simply from the central institution. It has to be done by the communities out there. So we've got to work harder. We've got to work harder to make sure that we continuously reinforce this message. But let me say that I think we're on a winning streak. You know, we all know the difference between the pessimist and the optimist, but why does the pessimist see the glass half empty, and why does the optimist see it half full? The pessimist is the unrealistic one. He comes from on top and he expects to see a full glass, and therefore as he looks down, he sees everything and he's disappointed. But the optimist comes from underneath. He knows the glass was originally empty, and therefore he can celebrate every drop that's in there. When we know where we were just 70 years ago, let alone 50, and where we've come in just within the last 50 years, the transformation is so dramatic that I fail to see how one can be anything other than optimistic about the course ahead in terms of relations between Catholics and Jews.
I think your spirit is absolutely amazing. And I think the reason there's a lot of negativity is that many people in the lockdown university, their families suffered so dreadfully in the war that it's going to take a long time. But whilst people like you are involved in this work, and I'm going to finish with what I think is an absolutely intriguing question. People are talking about the Judaica in the Vatican. Will you and your colleagues ever have access to all those wonderful Jewish books? And even a really good question, what happened to the temple in Jerusalem? What happened to the great menorah and all the treasures? Are they hidden away in the Vatican?
So this is a bit, this one with the Vatican is a bit like, have you stopped beating your sister? So whatever answer you give incriminates you. So when we say there's no evidence whatsoever that the temple vessels were ever in Vatican possession, people say, but they don't tell you or they don't show you. If you say, well, I've visited the area where archives are stored and where the Judaica is kept, they say, well, they haven't shown you everything that's in there. There is absolutely no historical evidence to support the idea that the Vatican was ever in possession of any temple vessels. Any gold or silver, anything precious, would have been melted down and used by various Roman emperors long before it became the Holy Roman Empire. And Rome was sacked by the Vandals, and there's much more chance that the Ark of the Covenant really is in the Ethiopian controlled in Luxor than anything is to be found in Rome today. So that, I don't think those claims or those statements are really serious. But the Vatican certainly does have an amazing collection of Judaica, manuscripts, and incredibly important publications. I must say that to their credit, there have been a number of cultural exchanges since the establishment of full diplomatic relations between Israel and the Holy See, and the Israel Museum has received many of those manuscripts to be put on display for various exhibitions that have taken place in Israel. Allow me to be a little bit undiplomatic, though, and tell you a story, a proposal I made that was rejected. I made the proposal during the negotiations with the Vatican to my colleagues in the foreign ministry, and they rejected it because they were worried it might be considered offensive. I suggested that we get like a postdoctoral student or somebody to be able to correlate the date of acquisitions of Judaica, all of which are there within the Vatican archives, with expulsions or any pogroms or actions against Jewish communities. And if you can correlate dates of expulsions or of attacks on Jewish communities with dates of acquisition of these aspects of Judaica, I think you can make a moral case that the Vatican has a responsibility, at the very least, to put these on permanent loan to the State of Israel. But as I said, that recommendation was rejected. It was seen as potentially involved in that particular regard.
It's been such an extraordinary experience, your talk, interviewing you, and I do hope you'll come back. And I want to hand over to Wendy.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Rosen. That was an extraordinary presentation. Thank you. So I've learned so much myself, to be honest. It's been transformational for me. You know, I didn't realize that there'd been such an enormous U-turn regarding the Vatican towards towards us. And I would like to take Trudy's, take up Trudy's ask. We would love to have you back, please, to explore different avenues, some of which you've suggested yourself. And I second you. So I think that you should continue along that track, you know, with the Vatican. I think that's an excellent idea and an excellent proposal. I'm sure that in time, if you persist with it, I'm sure you will find somebody else of more importance to back you. So thank you. Thanks a million. Thank you, Trudy. And we look forward to having you back with us soon. On that note, I want to say good night to you, because it's, what's the time in Israel now?
It's almost 9 o'clock.
Oh, okay.
But I wish you all a Chag Atzmaut Sameach.
Thank you very, very much. And our warmest regards to Sharon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Trude. And to the rest of you, I just want to say thank you very much. And just to remind you that in half an hour, we have another presentation with the Jewish Museum. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Night, night. Bye-bye.